We're still in Matthew, continuing according to the series we've been doing. We're in Matthew's fourth section, which again I have summarized according to these sort of two diverging paths, that Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. So you're going one way or you're going the other way as we go through these next several chapters here in Matthew. Now we're in the latter half of this fourth section, which I have characterized as being stories about disciples and doubters. You know, we were talking about all those parables Jesus gave. Now we're in more stories about things Jesus says and does, but still the same basic idea. You're either a disciple that's, seeing more of these signs that Jesus does and believing more, or you're one of the doubters just growing more stubborn and more opposed to Christ. So same basic idea, just different format. We're going from parables to actual accounts. Now, this passage today is very unique for a gospel story, in that it is one of the few passages in the Gospels which are not actually about Jesus. We're in a story today in which Jesus is a very minor character, surprisingly. So switching the focus a little bit, today's story focuses more on a man named Herod Antipas, who was the Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. I will explain what that means later. But basically, we're talking about this guy and not so much Jesus. So let's read that passage, and then we'll get moving through the message. This is Matthew 14, verses 1 through 12. So at that time, which would be about the time Jesus went to Nazareth and had his not so good reception there, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people, because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. So, again, not much about Jesus, more about this guy, Herod Antipas. Now, I think Matthew has included this story for several reasons. I don't necessarily want to ignore all of them. I mean, there are several reasons why this story might be here in Matthew's Gospel. For one thing, it effectively concludes the life of John the Baptist. I mean, it's his death. John the Baptist, of course, is a very important character, the forerunner prophet of Jesus, so you'd like to know what happened to him. So in that sense, the story is useful there. Another reason to include this story is that John himself functions as a kind of foreshadowing of Jesus. What happens to John is very much where Jesus is going. I mean, after all, you have this righteous prophet who gets killed by corrupt authorities. That is ultimately where Jesus is headed. I mean, right? He's going to find himself in a very similar situation, even including Herod Antipas to some degree. So you have sort of this literary foreshadowing here of what's going to happen to Jesus. The story also shows one of the many opinions that people had about Jesus back in his day, just the kinds of things people were saying about him. One of them was that he was a resurrected John the Baptist, which is kind of definitely a strange way to view Jesus from our perspective, but that's what some people were saying. That's what Herod himself thought. So you have all those reasons, and those are all valid points of discussion for this passage. But I have decided to focus this message on what may very well be Matthew's chief purpose for providing us with this story, and so that's what I really want to focus on today in my message. And so for that reason, I'm calling today's message Herod or Jesus. Kind of, again, moving with this sort of two diverging paths you can take here as you think about what you want to do with Jesus here. One of the key themes, of course, of this fourth section is that the opposition to Jesus becomes more stubborn. you see them get worse to some degree. And the question is, how does that look? If you look at any of these people and their lives, how does that actually look when you see these people turning more and more against truth? Well, Matthew provides us with a great example of how that looks, of how spiritual stubbornness appears and its consequences, what the results are of that. In this account of Herod Antipas, you see, when you really start to think about it, a lot of his life and how it looks for a person to turn more and more hostile against truth, which I think is ultimately why Matthew has included it in so much detail and in this part of his gospel. And in the end, when you think about Herod, and this is the way my thoughts were going as I was studying all this, you ultimately have a choice. You can either become like Herod, or you can become more like Jesus. You again have a choice here to make. You have two pathways going in opposite directions, and you can either become more like one person or more like the other. And the trick is, unfortunately, if you're not becoming more like Jesus, you are becoming more like Herod. In that degree, you really don't have a choice. To choose against Jesus is to automatically choose to be more like this guy that we're going to study today. So that ultimately is what I want to get across to you in this message. And I have 4 points. I want to do this 4 stages here. First of all, just that stubbornness is exemplified by Herod Antipas. And I really want to introduce you to the man. We actually know somewhat, some detail about this person, and I just think it's proper to be acquainted with him before we start tearing into his life. Secondly, stubbornness leads to ever greater sin, which is my longest point of the message, and I really want to focus on all the ways you see Herod just go further and further down in his sinfulness. And you really get a lot of detail about that. Thirdly, that stubbornness and sin lead to spiritual stupidity or foolishness, which again is a point that is often made in this whole section of Matthew. I think Herod exemplifies that wonderfully. And then finally, just that stubbornness toward truth is dangerous. That Herod provides us with a very stern warning in terms of how we deal with truth. Now, unfortunately, as I just implied there, the passage today is not just about one man. It'd be very easy to come in here and say it's about, Herod, here's this one guy, this is what it was like, oh, how bad for him. It's not just about him. The problem is these failings we see in Herod Antipas are relived by every person who opposes truth. It's not an isolated event. It's not just one man. He's an example of what everyone is like who sets himself against God. So hear this story and be warned by it, because that is its purpose. You're supposed to hear these things and realize just how sober a thing it is to not hear truth and not obey it. So that's what I'm really hoping to get across to you. Again, I think it's the main reason why this story is here, so I want to focus on that. So for starters, stubbornness is exemplified here by Herod Antipas. And since we're going to be focusing so much on him, I again think it's important to know something about the person, just who he is, why he's worthy of mention in any degree whatsoever. So let's do a summary of his life and reign, just a little bit here. Nothing too complicated, not an overflow of names and dates, but enough to get you acquainted with who this guy is. Now, if the name Herod sounds familiar, it's because you have encountered another Herod actually earlier in Matthew's gospel, another guy of the same name. This guy is known as Herod the Great. How you want to use that particular title is probably a subjective judgment, but Herod the Great, as he is known to history, King of the Jews, as his title was back then. Now, Herod the Great was appointed by the Romans as a client king. Now, if you don't understand what that is, basically, if the Romans establish dominance over an area, but they don't really want to bother to rule it, they kind of get the thrill of conquest, but not the responsibility. They kind of take some guy that's there and he says, okay, you're king now, you rule this place for us, but you answer to us, but you're in charge. And then they go and do whatever it was the Romans do. So basically that's a client king, and that was Herod the Great. He was a king, yes, but kind of under Rome in that regard. Now this was the same Herod, Herod the Great, who killed all the little children in Bethlehem because there was this other king of the Jews that was allegedly born there, and he didn't like that very much. Jesus was born there, and he heard about this, and he said, we got to do something about this. So that Herod the Great is the same guy that did that. So if this name sounds familiar, you're probably thinking of that Herod. He died probably within about a year of his attempt to kill Jesus by killing all those children in Bethlehem. So he died out of the picture. Now, when he died, his kingdom was divided into several pieces between some of his sons, basically. The sons that he did not kill in his paranoia were able to inherit some land. And one of those sons was Herod Antipas, the guy we're studying today in our passage. Herod Antipas was made ruler of Galilee and Perea. Galilee you're probably familiar with because that's where Jesus is from, where he spends most of his time. Perea is a smaller region. They're generally in the north and the east of the land of the Jews of Palestine. So that's generally where Herod's dominion is. Now, those regions were about 1/4 of what Herod the Great ruled. So Herod Antipas gets 1/4 of his father's territory. And because he got 1/4 of that land, he was called a tetrarch. That means ruler of a fourth. So he is not a king. Let's make that very clear. It'll be somewhat important for a detail later in our passage. But Herod Antipas is not a king. He is a tetrarch. He gets 1/4 of a king's land. So kind of viewed as a raw deal. That also is important for his life later. But that's basically who he is. Now, Herod Antipas, not a very important figure for history in general. In all likelihood, in your world history classes, probably not going to encounter Herod Antipas very much. Not an important guy in terms of world events, but definitely important for the ministry of Christ. Very important for reading the Gospels to understand a little bit about who this guy was. Generally, if you encounter a man named Herod in the Gospels, you're dealing with Herod Antipas, who was the ruler of Galilee and Perea. So generally, if you see Herod at any point after the birth of Jesus, you're dealing with this guy. This is the Herod, of course, that had his conflict with John the Baptist. It's probably what he's most famous for. You see the way that ends here in this passage. Eventually, this same Herod comes into conflict with Jesus. There are some passages in the Gospels where he seems to want Jesus dead. When Jesus has his trials at the very end of his life, Herod is one of the guys that he goes before and gets a very raw encounter there. Herod has his men mistreat Jesus very badly there. So that's Herod. So very commonly encountered in the Gospels. You also encounter a group of people called the Herodians. Every now and then you see them, not perhaps a very big group in the Gospels, but they are there. These are pretty much the supporters of the Herod family, of that dynasty. Basically, their desire chiefly was to see the Herod dynasty, the Herod family, rule all of Palestine again, just like in the days of Herod the Great. That's basically what they want. They want more local control of their land. Unfortunately, by this time, the Romans decided to go ahead and install a governor. That's where you get guys like Pontius Pilate. So there's all kinds of political stuff happening there. But you see the Herodians there, the supporters of guys like Herod, the Herod family. Not a name you're going to encounter very often in history at large, but for studying the history of Christ's ministry, very important to know something about Herod Antipas. Now, the sad thing about Herod, and this is more where we get into our own passage here, he is most important in the Gospels as an example of sin. Not a good character by any means, very much a bad guy, if you want to call him that. At every stage, Herod and his supporters are opposed to truth. They are very much in this stubborn category of people who are opposed to Jesus. But even when you compare Herod to other villains, the other guys you encounter in the Gospels, he seems to look really bad. I mean, even among the other bad guys, Herod is like lowest of the low, it seems. Perhaps the only person that really outclasses him in terms of evil is probably Judas Iscariot. I mean, in terms of Judas, you can't really beat that kind of guy who was with Jesus so closely and still turns on him. I mean, that's pretty bad. But Herod is probably just one step, above Judas in that respect. I mean, Herod just comes across looking very wicked. I mean, you contrast him with other guys like Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor there. At least he tried to get Jesus released to some degree. Yeah, he caved in the end, and not exactly the most upright judge, but at least he saw that these are trumped up charges, Jesus should be released, and at least to some degree, he tried. Herod doesn't have that sense of mercy. when Jesus comes to him, he has him whipped and mocked and all that stuff. I mean, pretty badly. Or how about Caiaphas the high priest? Another big mover and shaker over there in Palestine in those days. Well, he's certainly very bloodthirsty. I mean, he's one of the guys that wants to see Jesus dead. But the thing about Caiaphas is he at least comes across as a strong character. A guy that, fights his own battles. He has a backbone. Kind of like Herod the Great was back in the day. Yeah, he was brutal, but you don't mess with this guy. I mean, he's a strong ruler. Herod, he's kind of like a kitty cat who thinks he's a tiger. He thinks he's something big, but he's really not. And every now and then it comes out. You don't want to be this guy in any degree. There's no glory whatsoever. Even in the, very, tame way you might speak of glory among sinners, Herod doesn't even have that. Herod Antipas is just really, really low on the scale of virtue. He comes across like that, which is what makes him ultimately such a great example of stubbornness, spiritual opposition there, and the effects of it, which is where I'm going largely in this message. I think Herod Antipas is a great example of those things, which is what I want to dive into now. So point 2 here, that stubbornness leads into ever greater sin. And in just these few verses here, you really see that in Herod's life. Just an ever-escalating wickedness in this man's life. This is the longest point in the message, which is a real testament to how evil this man really was in so many ways. In 3 ways, really, I want to just take this and just detail those ideas for you and show you how stubbornness toward truth leads to ever worse manifestations of sin. You start sinning here, it's going to get worse. You see that in 3 different ways in Herod's life, and I really want to focus on those things. So number 1, Herod ignores law and then pursues perversion. He goes from one to the other. He ignores law and then pursues perversion. So Herod, to a large degree, begins his career of notable sins by ignoring the law of God. Now I want to read from the law of Moses back here, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21. You don't really have to turn there. It's just a brief statement here. One of these laws that God gave to Israel through Moses, if a man takes his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness, and they shall be childless. Very brief, boom. If you do this, it's impurity. So don't do that. Very simple law here in the law of Moses, specifically prohibiting men from marrying the wives of their brothers. You just don't do that. Now, the law of Moses does make one exception to this. Of course, you have these situations where maybe the brother dies and he hasn't had any children yet. Now his family name is going to go extinct. So then you, as the brother, you're supposed to come in, marry the widow, raise up children for your brother. That sort of thing, we call it a levirate marriage. That's pretty much the only exception. Generally, though, you're not supposed to marry your brother's wife. You just don't do that. It's in the law of God. Well, Herod Antipas decided that he did not care what God said. He decides he's going to go his own way here. And you see in the passage here a very brief summary of the relationship he has with his brother's wife. He has her. Just verse 3 here. Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." So here's a man who has married his brother's wife. Now, as we often do, we can thank a Jewish historian, Josephus, for giving us a bit more detail here. He actually tells us quite a bit about Herod Antipas and this particular situation with Herodias. So the full story is much worse than it sounds. Basically, the way it goes. Herod was actually already married to an Arabian princess, which doesn't sound too bad, honestly. Married to this woman here, kind of one of those political alliance things, going on. So he's already married, and then one day he goes to Rome and visits his brother and sees his brother's wife, Herodias. And these two decide that they are going to divorce their spouses so they can be together and get married. Okay, so that's basically what happened. They went through with that. So Herod and Herodias divorce their mutual spouses, and they marry each other. And now this man Herod has his brother's wife, or his ex-wife technically. And that's basically what happened. And it all seems like a soap opera, right? You would watch these kind of, seedy, racy stories on TV, and it's basically what it's like. That's pretty much what happened in Herod's life. However, interesting to note, at this point, there are probably, I'm just going to say this here, there are probably a lot of people in the world that'd be tempted to make excuses for Herod and Herodias for this that they did, right? I mean, a lot of people would probably just not be too hard on them. All's fair in love and war, you hear that expression. Hey, so long as they're happy, that kind of thing. People just have a very, non-judgmental attitude on things like this. So you might look at this and say, okay, yeah, well, so he broke some stuffy rule. Is it really that big of a deal? I mean, is it really a problem? Well, the thing is, this kind of sin grows into other things, and that's what you see. Herod's sin is soon going to become inexcusable to the point where no one would really justify it. Because before long, Herod moves on to what I call the pursuit of perversion, to actual pervertedness, if you want to use that word. Here in our passage, chapter 14, verse 6, let's see here. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod. One very simple verse there, but there's a lot there. Let's dissect this a little bit. 3 details on this that I came across as I was studying this. First of all, just to be very blunt here, perhaps not as blunt as I could be, the dance is probably not a ballet, okay? It's probably not any of the more respectable forms of dancing. Let's not forget that this is a birthday party for a rich guy and his drinking buddies. I can let you imagine the kind of entertainment going on there. So this kind of dancing, probably not in any sense moral or respectable or decent in any sense of the imagination you might have about it. It's probably not good. Okay, first detail. Second detail, right? This girl is Herod's stepdaughter. Let's not forget this. This is Herodias' daughter. Herod married Herodias. This is his stepdaughter, right? Okay, she's in the family. Now you would think he'd be very protective, right? I mean, you would think that he would sort of assume the fatherly role. He is, a father now to this girl. I mean, you would think that he would be somewhat protective. Instead, what do you get? Hey, honey, get in here and dance for my drunken friends. I mean, is that any way for a father? I mean, even if he's not biologically, her father, is that any way to act? No, it's terrible. And the third detail, I mean, you go by the evidence, and I'm going by the evidence here. That's all I'm going to say. By the evidence, this girl is probably no older than 12. And I say that because of 2 things. First of all, the Greek word used for girl, sometimes translated little girl if it gives you an idea, which would be a very literal translation. They used it for females who were not yet married, not yet of marriageable age even. So kind of the underage idea there, you see. And then secondly, you got to remember here, in this time and place, girls are usually married by the time they're 13. And by the time you're 11 or 12, you've been betrothed to some guy, you're just waiting for the wedding day, and by 13, you're out of the house and married. So you take these 2 details together, the word used of her, and just knowing what we know of the culture, this is a very young girl. I mean, this is horrendous, frankly. This is bad stuff. I mean, all that to say, take these details together, this is a perverted thing. This is just all-out wickedness here. So let's think about this, okay? Just think about Herod, what we know about him so far. One day, he decides to throw caution to the wind, marry this woman even though she's his brother's wife already, divorce his Arabian princess wife, all this sort of thing. And you say, oh, well, so long as he's happy, maybe not be too hard on him. And then the next day, he and his friends are exploiting his underage stepdaughter, or whatever. I mean, that's where he got, from here to here. It's the same guy. Many people would probably, worldly people that is, probably not care so much about the first sin. But there are not many people in the world that would make any attempt to justify the second sin. That's just where he went. I mean, that's exactly what happened to this man. This stubbornness toward truth, this opposition to the law of God originally, eventually turns into something much, much worse. So this stubbornness leads to ever greater sin. First, he ignores the law of God and then pursues his perversion. That's just one example, by the way, of how this guy's sinfulness just gets worse and worse. We have 2 more. So here's another example of his escalating sin here, that Herod silences a prophet and then slays a prophet. The prophet, of course, being John the Baptist. John the Baptist was silenced by Herod for speaking truth. right? Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Okay, that's what John did. Now they say it's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong, and that is what John the Baptist figured out. The only thing John did was quote a law which God had given to that nation and which had been observed by that nation for centuries. I mean, it's not like some new thing he's saying here. This is what the Jews have always believed. I mean, they found this out back at the beginning of their history when God gave his law through Moses, right? I mean, that's all John did. To some degree, it's very non-radical when you think about it that way. But of course, Herod is a man of influence and a man of power, and so it therefore becomes a big deal. And Herod was not willing to listen to God-revealed time-honored truth at all. He very much hardened his heart against that, not only against the law of Moses, but against the prophet who was reiterating that law. So John was imprisoned. He's thrown in jail for speaking truth. Now again, just following through with the same thing I did last time, there are a lot of people in the world that probably wouldn't judge Herod too harshly for this. You might want to make excuses for the guy. After all, what if John had started a rebellion by criticizing the ruler of that region? Rebellions were very common in this time and place in history. There were several times where the Jews, got a bit rambunctious and started revolutions and everything. It did happen. And John is a popular man. He has crowds of people coming out there to the desert to listen to him preach. He is very influential. If he starts speaking against Herod, that could go very badly for law and order. So you might say, okay, yeah, well, it might not be a good thing to, imprison this guy, but hey, he's the ruler there. He's got to do something to maintain order, and this was the best thing possible. Well, you might say that. You might be willing to make those excuses for the guy, but again, it gets worse. Herod goes further into sin because then Herod slays that same prophet. He actually executes him. And you see that here toward the end of the story. Verse 8, prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison. So ironically, Herod's earlier sin came back to bite him, just couldn't get away from this, because it was his dear wife who prompted all this to happen. Without Herodias's behind-the-scenes plotting here, you get the idea John might have just stayed in prison, and that had been the end of it. But now, because of Herod's vindictive wife, Herod finds himself in this position where now he's going to kill this prophet. And that's exactly what happened. Without the old sin, the new sin would not have happened. So that's pretty notable there. Also notice, though, just the details of this. This is an execution. Do you realize it's an execution without a trial? What are the charges here? What did John do beyond the thing that got him landed in prison? Were there witnesses? Because in Jewish law, you got to have 2 or 3 witnesses to testify. You did something worthy of death before you can be killed. Where are they in all this? This is a total violation of any conception of justice here. No trial, no witnesses. It's just, hey, sorry, John, my wife wants me to kill you, so now I have to. That's it. That's all it is. It's an amazing thing here where Herod has found himself. First he imprisons the prophet, now he's killing him. You want to say at the very beginning, well, hey, at least Herod didn't kill John. And then he kills John. Whatever excuses you might make for this guy at the beginning, they're blown away by the end because the guy's sin gets even worse. It's not tame sin. It just keeps growing. It gets worse and worse throughout his life. The sin of Herod Antipas becomes more than he ever intended it to be. He thought throwing John in prison was probably going to be the end of it. Well, it wasn't the end of it. It got worse. First he silenced the prophet, and then you end up slaying the prophet. And that's what happens. Stubbornness toward truth leads you into ever greater sin in that kind of fashion. But we have another way that Herod exemplifies that. Third way, that Herod rejects the fear of God, then is driven by the fear of man. That's the state that he ends up in. Now, we see a few ways here, we've seen them already, in which Herod has no fear of God. He's not a God-fearing man, to use that expression. The law of God says, don't marry your brother's wife. Pretty clear. not at all open to interpretation. It's a very clear statute from God. Well, then Herod does it anyway. He says, well, I'll take my brother's wife. I'll do what I want. Well, then the prophet of God says, you have sinned by doing that. It's not right for you to have her. And then Herod imprisons that prophet. He just says, well, you can't say that to me, so you're going to jail. So Herod, not a God-fearing man, not at all. And as has been the case, again, just to kind of give a worldly perspective of all this, a worldly person might come to Herod's defense at this point and say, well, okay, he's not a God-fearing man, but does that really matter? I mean, does it really matter that you fear God? I mean, can't you be a moral, upright person, a decent person without all this, religious stuff, all this fear of God? I mean, that's a dumb idea, fearing God. Why would you do that anyway? I mean, that's the kind of thing that worldly people say. And such people might come to Herod's defense in some way and say, well, you don't have to, fear God to be an upright person. The problem is, the life of Herod shows that these claims are false. If you're not a God-fearing person, you end up in a very different state. In this case, you end up driven by the fear of men, because Herod is. All of the major decisions you see here are made because he fears somebody. First of all, something to note here, that Herod actually did consider of his own volition executing John, but did not do it. He didn't actually go through with that idea. Why was that? Well, let's see. Verse 5. And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. So that's why John the Baptist wasn't executed at first. Herod was afraid of the people. So here's a man crippled by the fear of other people, by the general public, really. So that's basically it. I mean, he's driven by fear not to do this one thing that he wants to do. But then, then Herod eventually changes his mind about killing John. Why? Again, the fear of people. Listen to this passage. There's a detail here. Chapter 14 again, verses 9 through 10. And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He said and had John beheaded in the prison. Because of his guests. I mean, there you are, you're at your party in front of all your friends, you shoot your mouth off, I'll give you anything you want. She wants the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Don't really want to go through with it, but hey, all your friends are here watching you. You said you'd do this, but you're going to back down now? You can't do that. So now his fear is of his guests here, and that's why he goes through with this execution. It's amazing. Herod's fear of the people kept him from killing John, but then his fear of his guests made him kill John. He goes back and forth, one way and the other, not for any reason beside fear. That's it. He fears this people, he does what they want. He fears this group of people, he does what they want. That's Herod's life. The guy has no spine. That's what I meant earlier when I said he's just not a strong person. He's not like Caiaphas. He's not like his father Herod the Great. He just has no sense of courage. He's driven by fear. On that note, kind of interesting, I mentioned earlier that Herod Antipas is technically not a king. He's a tetrarch. He rules a fourth of a kingdom. So it's very interesting then that Matthew, did you notice, actually does refer to him as a king at one point in our passage. It says, verse 9, and the king was sorry. The king was sorry. So in a sense, Matthew, in calling him a king, Herod becomes king for a day. He never got to be a king, but in a sense, in this one account, he gets to be king for one day. And what is his one act as king? He is sorry because he has to cave into his fear of his dinner guests and do something he doesn't want to do. Oh, what a king, right? I mean, maybe that's why he never got to be king. He doesn't deserve the title. But that's basically what this man is like. I mean, this king is just totally governed himself by fear. Fear is his king. I mean, that's basically all it is. So let's think about this. So again, the worldly person, you might want to believe, well, Herod doesn't fear God, but hey, you don't have to fear God. Why do you got to make everything religious? It doesn't matter. You can be an upright person and not fear God. Well then, in Herod's life, you see that because he doesn't fear God, he just spends his life as a slave to the fears of other people. Fears the general public, does what they want. Fears his dinner guest, does what they want. That's his life. It's not a virtue. There's nothing virtuous about that. He's not an upright man without the fear of God. He's a coward. He's a coward that does what other people tell him to do. That's it. He's totally enslaved by fear. Why? Because he rejected the fear of God. So there's your choice. You either fear God or you fear man. And you see that in Herod's life pretty powerfully. Now, to bring all this together here, Herod really is a classic example of this point I'm trying to make, that this stubborn opposition to truth just leads you into greater and greater sin. It's just going to make things worse. First he ignores law, then he pursues outright perversion. He silences a prophet, then he slays that prophet. He rejects the fear of God. After that, he becomes totally driven by the fear of men. I mean, he just gets worse. The story of Herod's life doesn't get any better. In fact, it doesn't even get any better after this point. Again, Josephus tells us a lot about this guy's life. We know some things from after the time of Jesus. Let's talk about those things. I think it's fair because Matthew's audience probably would have known these things anyway, so I can bring it into a study of Matthew. First thing, not long after the death of Jesus, Herod's small army, he doesn't have a great army by any means, but his military gets practically wiped out by someone. Do you remember that Arabian princess that he had divorced so he could marry his brother's wife? Well, the Arabs are not known for being merciful, just to be stereotypical here. And that girl's father decided he did not like that, and so he came in and just walloped Herod. And if not for Rome, it probably would have been much worse, but there was some intervention there and the guy had to back off. But, I mean, that's sin there. You know, divorcing this princess to marry his brother's wife still had consequences later in life. It just keeps coming back to bite this guy. In a sense, a lot of Herod's problems go back to that point where he did this one thing. Pretty terrible. But then there's another thing. One last thing. The last thing we know about Herod's life. He actually ended his life in exile, which basically is to say he got kicked out of every decent part of the empire, which is basically what that is. So anyway, one day, Herod decides that he decides that he deserves to be king, right? Which keep talking about here how he's not a king, he's a tetrarch. Matthew kind of mockingly calls him a king, but he's not a king. Well, he decides, you know what, I deserve to be king. So he goes to Rome and he says, hey, I want you guys to make me king of the Jews now. Make me a king. Well, the Romans don't typically like those kind of power plays, so they exiled him to France. You know, they just kicked him out of the country and said, okay, you've lost everything now. Just go over here and spend the last of your days there. The funny thing is, once again, the person that put Herod up to that, the person that wanted him to go ask to be made a king, guess who it was? Herodias, his wife. Again, just constantly, this woman and Herod's terrible decision about this woman totally comes back to destroy this man in every way imaginable. Herod, in that one act there toward the starting of his life, okay, he hardens his heart and stiffens his neck against truth, and just on and on, it just destroys him more and more. He goes into worse sin. He has all these calamities befall him because of his sin, just for his entire life. It's just so terrible. It's a sad thing. Herod is a great example of a very sad truth. This idea that once you make yourself stubborn against truth, you're just going to fall into greater and greater wickedness. Classic example, Herod Antipas. Now really, we can still go a bit further with this, and this is my third point here, that stubbornness and sin lead to spiritual stupidity. You know, you become a spiritual idiot, so to speak, once you give yourself over to sin and stubbornness to this degree. Now, this fits with something that Matthew records earlier. Jesus, in his parable sermon, makes this statement in chapter 13, verse 11. He says, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Right? So you have this principle here. To him who has, more will be given. To him who doesn't have, even what he thinks he has will be taken away from him. I mean, that's a general rule that Jesus makes in dealing with truth. That's why he speaks to the people in parables. Because the disciples, they get this stuff, they understand it. They're getting more because they've actually followed Jesus. The crowds, largely just kind of a shallow interest in Jesus, so they get parables to hide the truth. So even what they have gets taken away from them. So that's the way Jesus deals with people like this. Now the thing is, with Herod, you actually see another kind of illustration of this idea, that those people that harden their hearts against truth end up losing even what truth they have. Look at Herod's conclusion here, at the very beginning of the passage. Verses 1 through 2. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." So Herod believes that Jesus was a revived John the Baptist. Okay? Now, it's kind of funny reading the commentators on this because they're trying to figure out, how does that make sense? Why would he believe this? I mean, how is this a good opinion? How does this make any sense? Guess what? It doesn't make any sense. It's stupid. No matter how you assess this, when you put all the details together, there's no good reason for Herod to think that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead. There's no good reason. It's stupidity. It actually shows you what a guilty conscience can do. I mean, you see that here. I mean, this is just Herod's soiled conscience coming back to get him. He knows that he has just executed an innocent man. He knows John didn't deserve to die. The only reason he killed him is because his wife wanted him to. He knows he didn't deserve to die. He has blood on his hands, and that's going to plague his conscience. It's going to be on his mind. It's going to be a weight on his back. And now, here's John the Baptist come back from the dead to haunt him. That's what he sees. When he hears about this Jesus guy, all he sees is John, John, John. I mean, that's what the weight of a guilty conscience will do to you. And you see that in Herod. It blinds him to the truth. The truth is that Jesus is Jesus, and Jesus is the Messiah. And if he would just move past all these sins and this guilt that he has, he might see that. The problem is he can't. I mean, he has dug the hole so deep he can't get out of it. That's where he's gone here. Now he's at the point where his mind isn't clear. His eyes are blinded because of all this sin and because of all this stubbornness that he has and all the times that he's hardened his heart. He just can't see anything. All he sees is the sins and the guilt of the past. He doesn't see Jesus for who he is. So in this way, you see how his stubbornness toward truth and his resulting sins make him even more stupid than he was before on spiritual matters. I mean, what he had was taken away. I mean, the little truth that he might have had, living there among the Jews, among the people of God, what little benefit he might have had there was lost because he pursued wickedness so much. Now he's going around saying, "Oh, Jesus is John risen from the dead." I mean, he's just a paranoid, delusional, guilty man. That's what he has become. Why? Because of his wickedness and because of his hard-heartedness toward truth. Which leads us all to one conclusion. My last point for today in this message, that stubbornness toward truth is dangerous. It is a very dangerous thing to put up these walls against truth and try to not let it into your life. It's a terrible thing. Sin will always do more to you than you think it will. I mean, you think it's not going to be that bad, but sin has a way of making everything worse. You'd like to believe that you can compartmentalize your sin, right? You can put it in a box, you can keep it over here, and it's not going to bother you. You say things like, "Oh, I'll give anything to God, just not this. I'll do anything God wants me to do, just not that." You think you can keep your sin over here, serve God over here, but keep your sin over here and sort of keep it separate, and it's not going to bother you. The problem is it doesn't work that way. Sin is not like an object in a box. It's like a disease. It's like a plague. The whole way it works is that it spreads. You can't contain this. Sin doesn't work like that. Diseases spread, sin spreads. You let sin into your life, it's going to eat away your whole life. It's going to take over. It's going to have consequences far beyond what you ever thought possible. Look at Herod. On the day that he married Herodias, do you really think he said to himself, "Someday I shall be a paranoid, fearful, blood-stained pervert"? Do you think that's what he saw himself doing someday on his wedding day? Well, no, of course not. He didn't see that coming. He didn't intend those things to happen. He just thought he was marrying the woman of his dreams. That's all he thought was happening. And then that one act comes in and just takes over and drives him to greater and greater wickedness. And that's how it works. It doesn't end well. Sin will always do more to you than you think it will. Now, the world's false confidence is really blown to pieces by this observation. If they would really consider what this sort of thing is saying here, all of their confidence would be gone, because the world treats the truth of God as unimportant. Doesn't really matter. They say, oh, you can be a good person without God. You don't need God's truth. You don't need all this Jesus stuff. It's not important. No big deal. Well, ask Herod. I mean, he would say otherwise. His life is a sterling example of the opposite point. Herod heard a certain truth from two different preachers. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He heard that from John the Baptist. Later on, he heard it from Jesus. He resisted the idea consistently throughout his life. Herod does not repent. He doesn't care that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He's just going to keep going and doing what he's doing. And the result of all of that is not a perfectly moral man. It's not like, well, he doesn't believe the gospel, but he's an all right guy. No. I mean, the result was he just falls into ever greater wickedness and stupidity. He becomes evil and blind, plagued by a guilty conscience, full of so many sins. I mean, that's where he goes. The world has to realize that this kind of opposition to truth leads only in one direction. It's a downward spiral into wickedness. There is no other alternative. And this downward spiral of Herod is a great warning for those that would oppose truth. I mean, really, take this to heart. I keep telling you that Matthew wants to evangelize his people through his gospel here, and this, I think, is one of his points. I mean, doubtless many Jews, were in a similar state, right? Trying to put Jesus out of their mind, so to speak. It's about 30 years later, maybe. Jesus died about 30 years ago, was executed about 30 years ago. Here you are just trying to say, that Jesus guy, maybe, he wasn't anything. Surely not. Surely not. Well, warning, don't just push those thoughts away. Don't just harden your heart to the truth, because if you do, you might wind up like this guy, to some degree. I think Matthew really presents Herod as a warning to his readers against this kind of stubbornness, just not considering what God has said, what God has done. I think it's a very dire warning, a very evangelistic warning, but a sober one nonetheless, against hardening your heart to truth. So, really, you can end this message with a cliche. It is a cliche because we hear it often, but it's still true. This idea, be killing sin or sin will be killing you. We say that for a reason. And it's not just something that preaches nice. It's true. You're either going one way or the other. You're either you're either making advances against the sin in your life, or it is overtaking you. Now, the good news is it doesn't have to go one of those ways. You actually can repent. You can do the one thing that Herod did not do. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. Those are commands issued, which, if you will do those things, if you will take this stuff to heart and actually do those things, you can be less like Herod and more like Jesus. Going back to this dichotomy that I gave you. You don't have to just keep falling into ever greater and greater sin and stubbornness and foolishness. You don't have to go that way. If Herod had repented, he would not have gone that way. If you heed the gospel, you can escape all of that and get on a path that makes you more and more like Christ. True holiness, true righteousness, free from a guilty conscience, not blinded by the sins of the past like Herod was. You can repent. You don't just have to stand there in the hole that you're digging and dig it so deep that you can never get out. You can get out of the hole. Repent and believe the gospel. It's an amazing thing. Herod is a great example of the opposite, but the whole point is to get you to do the thing that he never did. Don't be like this guy. Okay, so I just want to summarize everything, and then I have one last passage I want to read just kind of as a final thought. But in summary, again, you have this passage. Matthew gives us an example of opposition to truth and stubbornness and the sin that it causes. And he does that through Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, who murdered John the Baptist and did a lot of other very bad things, is a classic example of what sin does, of what opposition to truth does to a person. Secondly, this stubbornness leads to ever greater sin. First example, Herod ignores law, then he pursues perversion. He silences a prophet, then he slays a prophet. He rejects the fear of God, and then becomes driven by the fear of man. In each case, his stubbornness leads to ever greater sin. There are no exceptions to this rule. Every time he sins, he gets more sin. And that's what you have. And then thirdly, this stubbornness and sin lead to spiritual stupidity. Even what he has, even what knowledge he has is taken away from him. His guilty conscience blinds him to the truth about Jesus, and all he sees are the ghosts of his past, namely John the Baptist, come back from the dead to haunt him. And then finally, this stubbornness toward the truth is dangerous. And it is a terrible thing to find yourself doing this, because sin will always do more than you think it will. It'll never stop just because you want it to stop somewhere. It doesn't work that way. You can either be more like Herod or more like Jesus, and you have to make that choice. And on that note, I wanted to read this final passage here. I often think about this when thinking of the split, again, sort of between sin and righteousness that is really the governing theme of this part of Matthew. Galatians 6, verses 7 through 8. Do not be deceived. Okay, so this is something on which you might deceive yourself. So do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that also he will reap. So if you put it in the ground, that's what you're going to get. You plant this kind of plant, you're going to be getting that kind of plant. Okay? For the one who sows to his own flesh will reap from the flesh corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. So there you go. You have the flesh, you have the Spirit. You can sow to one, you can sow to the other, but whatever you sow, you're going to get back. And Herod discovered that, right? I mean, he spent his whole life sowing to the flesh. Became a very fleshly person, a very corrupt person. Did not end well. You're supposed to sow to the Spirit. You sow to the Spirit, you get the fruits of the Spirit. Kind of what I was talking about in the legalism series. I mean, those are your options. You can sow to one, you can sow to the other. There's no third ground there. So you got to make the right choice. Herod's a great example of what happens going the opposite way. Well, anyway, this whole passage, again, very much a warning. Hope it serves that way in your life. That's pretty much all I had to say today. Are there questions on this or comments?